Hello, friends. My name's host Eric. I'm just talking with famous people. And in today's video, I would like to discuss the issue of what is a metaframe. What do I mean by cognitive functions comprises the metaframe, and why it's not something else, and how you can test to see if something's a metaframe really is the metaframe. So the thing about the metaframe, it means everything else in reality can be explained according to its terms. So there are plenty of people in the world who want essentially physics to be the metaframe, and they say all of humanity, all of human consciousness is explained by neurons firing, matter, etc. But biology is not physics. There are different things. Biological processes and the processes of non-living objects in motion are very different. And consciousness especially is the key distinguishing quality of life. To some extent, everything that's alive has some kind of consciousness, but that's neither here nor there. The key thing is, if we look at something like, let's say, the study of microbes, well, how is that linked to cognitive functions? Well, the thing is, whatever people have concluded about microbes and how they've concluded it, what kind of statements they're making about it, and how they're justifying those statements or failing to justify those statements, what conclusions they're drawing from what's been established, additional to the conclusions that have been established by their presentation or whatever. In other words, what it might mean in a larger picture. All of those elements are explained by cognitive functions. The only reason it seems like something like microbes is not explained by cognitive functions is because using language to designate something an object of analysis outside of human beings is part of why we can communicate meaningful information, is because we can treat that information as being unlinked to human observation for the purposes of analysis. For lots of kinds of presentations that want to validate publicly, then they need to present objective data. Objective data does not mean the data is correct, blah, 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 blah. It means it's data gathered in a transparent way and presented publicly so that everybody can analyze it independently. So the thing is, when we talk about microbes, we might want to learn about microbes for some specific reason that we're going to use to do something of our own. And so the nice thing about that kind of information is that it works well in this strategy that language affords us to set something apart as though it weren't impacted by our own observations and personalities, and convey information about the thing independent of the subject, mainly the person conveying information. Other people can come across that information, read it, gain the same knowledge from it, and apply it themselves. It works best for things that are about basically anything but consciousness, right? So if I'm talking to you about, like, for example, the other day I Googled, can you smoke 5 amps? And I gained information from Cora regarding the question. And I believe that information, which is to say, I'm treating it as knowledge, and I am thereby informed that no, you can't smoke by vans. It won't do anything at all. It's specifically designed to be abuse resistant, like that. Basically, and then it explained why, right? It's like the amphetamine molecule is bound to a lysine molecule that compels the body to process it only through the liver. So you also can't boof it. Anyway, I think that now see, that's a conclusion I drew based on the information I read, but it didn't actually specifically say that. But based on the explanation of its mechanism of why you can't smoke it and or snort it, I concluded you also can't boof it. That I'm treating as speculative to some extent. I'd have to verify that exactly, because I'm not really sure about the biological mechanics of the differ between, say, the mucous membrane and inside your butthole. Anyway, the point is that kind of information works so well in terms of our conveyance of it that it's created for many of us the illusion that we're actually talking about things independent of individuals talking about them. That's never the case. But most significantly, the metaframe for personality type is, of course, going to explain the most difficult thing to explain of all, human consciousness. All expression of human consciousness can be described as one of the kinds of paying attention and one of the varieties of each of those kinds, or one of the varieties of each of those kinds. So, like, if there's a guy in a coma, you can explain what's going on with him as he only has biological SI operating. That is to say, and even then, a reduced form of it. He has autonomic breathing. He can still digest food, etc. Introverted sensing is a knowing function that it's first and foremost a biological knowing function that doesn't involve any language at all. It's your body knowing when you're sleepy, your body knowing when you're hungry, your body knowing when you have to poop, all that kind of stuff, right? Now, if you're like me, you always convert that body information into words. And as a consequence, I tend to think of SI as being much more word-oriented than it naturally is, because I'm an NE-DOM. I'm much more likely to remember the words for things than the experiences. Or remember the meanings that ensued from experiences. So, when we recognize that every single thing you can point to and say, just guess that it always can collapse down into a cognitive function analysis that draws meaningful distinctions. I could say about that guy in the coma, well, he's got fewer neurons firing, but he's still alive. Oh, dead cat. Somebody ran over a cat right there. But then, why is he still breathing? Oh, well, because that's in that part of the brainstem. Well, now all of a sudden you're mixing your explanations, right? You're saying it's all about neurons firing and basically the physics of the microscopic level shit going on in the brain, right? But then you're saying, well, this part of the brain controls this part of the brain controls that, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. let's say it can explain stuff like being in a coma. It still can't explain why. Basically, it doesn't explain our observations, and that's what you want. The top level frame needs to explain all of our observations within its terms, and every other explanation that could be provided needs to be subsumed by that metaframe explanation. And that's what you see when you're talking about cognitive functions. Whatever you're saying, I can most correctly describe and explain it as those words are artifacts you're spewing of your function configuration. They're expressive of these values that correlate with these functions as this kind of a bias, blah, 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 blah. I explain every single thing that with cognitive functions that way. I can't necessarily always be right in my explanation of the specific thing. So I might say, for example, because writing gives you a chance to take a long time to express a small amount of words if you want to, I might read some text and say, this is expressive of these function values and that kind of a bias, and it turned out that the person not actually be the type that would have that bias, etc., right? But see, that's the thing. Even then, the taxonomy of the bias is going to be correct, and then you're left with an explanation of why did this person who's not of that type express the bias of a different type. In that context, it can be lots of different reasons, especially with written text, because let's say you're in a class where the teacher wants you to write essays like meow, and you're a TE dom, so you always want to interface, especially TE SI, you always want to interface with what the teacher wants and try to produce that, even if it's a bad idea or whatever. So you might see somebody successfully TE their way into writing a NETI style essay. You don't know their process of how they got there, but there will be nevertheless an explanation both of the object, the text as an object of analysis, independent of the person who made it, but nevertheless still subject to the same omnipotent mapping powers of cognitive functions, because they express not just as attentional manners, but when we treat them as objects of analysis, as values. They imply certain justification metrics, they imply certain absolute values or value frames. They often are utilizing a certain kind of value criterion without knowing it. Those are debate terms that mean basically, like in Lincoln Douglas debate, the topic might be, should repeated victims of domestic violence be, it might be like affirmed, repeated victims of domestic violence have the right to use deadly force against their abusers. So you might say, my value is justice. In other words, the case I'm going to make, you should vote for it because it's the most just answer to this question, either yes or no. And I'm going to have a value criterion for justice of retributive justice. Like, in other words, people who do bad things have to be punished to restore a moral equilibrium to the world or something. That's how you attain justice. The value criterion tells you how you attain the value. So the thing is, every time people are making or saying things or even doing things, they're revealing necessarily, to some extent, that the unavoidable reality, which is they're paying attention in some but not all ways, and that's somewhat visible to other people. So the thing is, if you're testing to see if something's the metaframe, you need to look at lots of different things And go, okay, well, how does the Metaframe explain that tree? Well, it explains that tree as something I intended to in order to produce an example of something that's not a human consciousness, but nevertheless can be explained by cognitive functions, because ultimately everything that I, you, anybody brings up is predicated on human observation / attention. Otherwise, how is it being communicated about, right? So, what does it mean then to say that something is the metaframe, and how should that impact our thinking? Well, basically it means that if we remember that that's the metaframe, we will be protected against many intellectual pitfalls. So when somebody says, which is correct, the correspondence theory of truth or the messenger theory of truth, it's called something like that. Well, the answer is neither of those are accurate. Both of those are wrong, and why they're wrong is explained by cognitive functions. In other words, they were wrong because the people who were doing the intellectual work, even though they were good at doing intellectual work, were doing it under the wrong frame of reference, and the kinds of explanations that they present tell you a lot about whether they're, say, NETI or NITE or whatever. So, as discussed in a previous video, truth is instead of whatever those theories say, which are all about managing the economics of the duality between subject and object, basically. But the reality about truth is it's a term that exists in order for people to be able to dispute statements. And when we remember that that's why it exists, and we remember that how people are going to use that term and in which context they're going to dispute what kind of statements, that's all about cognitive functions. Now, you might claim, what about something like Enneagram? It seems to also explain things correctly and doesn't need to use the frame of cognitive functions to explain things correctly. Well, it's correct that it doesn't need to use the frame of cognitive functions to explain what it's explaining correctly, provided it's informed sufficiently by the frame of cognitive functions to know what it ought not try to explain with its model. It's not even a model, really. It's a taxonomy. And most specifically, it's a taxonomy of FI. People's FI strategies, it turns out, are pretty consistent in dealing with different kinds of negative emotions. Right now, I'm feeling a lot of shame because I embarrassed myself in front of the neighbors the other night and maybe harmed our relationship with them. I'm not sure. I'm feeling a lot of shame. I'm a 4. So I used to say you deal with shame as a 4 by saying, fuck you and your rules, I'm me and I know better. But the other way to deal with shame as a 4 is, instead of being helpful, or instead of showing that you're achieving unconventional standards, you judge yourself as harshly as possible and condemn yourself in the most mean words imaginable, and do so for days, as I have been doing for the last couple of days. I keep singing a song, I wish I were dead now, then I wouldn't have to feel so much shame. I don't actually wish that, but that's, how it is when you're mortified, humiliated by your own bad behavior. Like, if you've ever gotten blackout drunk before, you know the feeling. I didn't get drunk, that's not what caused this to happen for me, but it feels equivalent. So regardless, Enneagram tells us how we're going to deal with, avoid, etc., negative emotions of shame, fear, and anger. It correctly predicts that as a 4, instead of trying to be helpful, or achieving on conventional metrics, I'm going to use my own judgment. It's just in this case, my own judgment is, Eric, you're horrible. I hate you. I've also been singing, I hate myself when I think about this. Okay, so this behavior of mine can usually be explained by cognitive functions. I've got SI fourth, which means I have a conscious but not very robust relationship with subjective knowing. But because SI is triggered by associations, I embarrass myself right outside of my house. So I'm constantly seeing that spot, or being near it, or seeing the neighbor's house, and being constantly triggered to remember this thing that I don't want to think about. And then I'm feeling the corresponding negative emotion. And my strategy for dealing with it is I will condemn myself mercilessly until I feel like I've learned my lesson or something. In this instance, I'm not sure what I should have done differently. I'm not sure entirely how much culpability I have, but it just feels like getting too drunk, so I know how to hate myself over that, right? And that's, again, subjective knowing. Like, when I objectively analyze what happened, I view myself as having reduced culpability. But I don't treat myself accordingly, because emotional stuff isn't intellectual stuff. If I feel ashamed of myself, that's not something you can intellectualize away, really. So, there was one other sort of main point I wanted to make about the Metaframe, quote unquote. I guess I made most of the points I was going to make. I just wanted to reiterate how SI is a non-language form of knowing in its most native expression. When I play guitar, my fingers remember the chord shapes. I don't have to figure it out every time I want to play a C, you know? And that's a form of SI. I have in the past done things like found myself driving to a house I no longer lived to. That's a form of SI where my body just like turned there, you know? And I guess just to also reiterate that because everything can be collapsed down into or explained by or converted into a cognitive function explanation, and no other kind of explanation can universalize like that. That's why it's the Metaframe. And I would additionally state that the prime directive is like the metaframe within the model, but you'd call it just basically the frame. It's saying that every cognitive function instance can be converted and expressed into a way of dealing with the prime directive of closing the gap between expectations and realities. So each attentional configuration can be expressed as a strategy to uphold the prime directive, which is have reality be like you have it mapped it out to be. Okay, that's enough. I don't want to get too rambly. I've already gotten too rambly. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to punch it.